Good morning, and thank you to Greg and William for inviting me under strange circumstances, and to Mannkal. I'm standing here twice a fraud. I'm not Henry Ergas, and therefore I'm not amusing and full of anecdotes. And secondly, Henry's never written a paper. So about 4 or 5 weeks ago, Henry phoned me up, and I have a habit. When Henry phones me up, I act as his Boswell. I take very detailed notes. They've been very profitable for me. I knew the possibility that Henry may not make it, but would write a paper, and that I'd need to deliver the paper, so I thought it was a good idea. We had a long conversation about what he was going to write, and I took notes, not realising that actually he's never going to write the paper until after the conference. So what I have here are 3 pages of notes that I took of what Henry's paper might have been about. Don't blame Henry, blame me. And I'll talk as though I'm the person who's Henry. Pretend, I mean, Henry doesn't look like me, but you can pretend that I'm Henry. So this paper is about the contrasts and similarities between 2 famous books. First famous book is W.K. Hancock's 1930 volume Australia, which has been mentioned. Probably one of the one of the very small numbers of extremely well-known books in Australia, of which The Tyranny of Distance, that Geoffrey Blainey wrote, is probably the most famous title, because who can ever remember the title Australia? But you can remember Tyranny of Distance. Much wiser choice. But he chose the title because he was asked to write a book in a series on countries, and he wrote this on that title. So it's a contrast and comparison between the book of 1930, Hancock's Australia, and the book written in the 1830s, 1835 first volume, 1840 second volume, by Tocqueville, a French aristocrat, and according to John Elster, a philosopher, the world's first social scientist. Tocqueville wrote a 2-volume book called Democracy in America, and the paper that Henry will write is about comparison between those 2. I've just got to get some water. Actually, it's better for me if I have it in a bottle. That way, if I knock it over, it won't spill so far. Some in here. We usually have a bottle. Oh, no, I haven't forgot. Thanks.
Couldn't find a bottle?
No, I couldn't find my bottle. My nanny hasn't packed it for me. Tocqueville, I'm not going to try to give you urging to read any more urging to read Hancock's volume. It's full of interesting insights. I had a room next to Sir Keith Hancock, or as Noel Button called him, thrice a night Hancock, for about 15 years or 14 years, and I couldn't get any word from him about this book. Youthful indiscretion were the only 2 words that I ever got. Tocqueville seriously influenced Hancock in this book, and maybe it's useful to look at Hancock writing the Australian equivalent of what Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America about America. In the readings that Greg gave you access to, the chapter from Hancock, Hancock refers to Tocqueville. Clearly, Tocqueville was a model of some sort for Hancock, and the table of contents of Australia echoes to some extent the table of contents in Democracy in America. In addition, Many of Hancock's formulations echoed those in Democracy of America, and there are some concepts which have been taken directly from Democracy in America, including, for example, something which I won't be able to explain called the exasperation of the debate. So there are two books with perspectives that are different but convergent. Tocqueville wrote Democracy of America so he could understand France. That was his purpose. Hancock, who was extremely alienated from Australia, left Adelaide, defected from Adelaide in some sense. He wrote Australia in order to understand his country. He'd been outside the country for a while. Both books are fundamentally about democracy, its nature, and the effects of democracy. Tocqueville comes out of his book with a great optimistic view of democracy, but his optimistic view, somewhat paradoxically, is ultimately swamped by a pessimism. He's a great believer and fan of democracy, believes that it's inevitable and very desirable, but comes out at the end thinking that it requires decentralisation, checks and balances at the political and social level, but inevitably leads to centralisation and the overweening social power of the state, in which the state becomes the dominant perspective that people in the society have, rather than individual or local. I mentioned that a philosopher calls Tocqueville the first social scientist because Tocqueville tried to talk motivations of individuals and their consequences for the society in which they are operating. Individuals react to the social and political environment they're in, but by reacting they create the social and political environment they're in. Sometimes they change the social and political environment, sometimes they reinforce it. And Tocqueville was extremely interested in that. That's the essence of social science, in my opinion. So Tocqueville had a lot of discussions where there was invisible motivations led to reaction which was unintended by the people who acted. They intended one thing and something else came out, including changes of their own views and motivations. In economics, we're so used to people act in such a way as to produce an equilibrium, which keeps on going in some mystical sense. Tocqueville was more interested in people act in order to produce something that changed, including their own motivations might change. So he was very interested in what shaped individual behaviour and tracing those through to the social outcomes. As I mentioned, Tocqueville ended up believing that democracy had a strong tendency towards centralisation and a soft form of despotism. In Tocqueville, democracy sometimes meant the political system of democracy, sometimes meant equality. Tocqueville thought it was inevitable and desirable, but that was a proposition no means fully accepted at the time, as events in France soon displayed. Now, 100 years later, when Hancock was writing, in a sense one could say mass democracy had triumphed. But this was the late 1920s, he published in 1930, there were dark clouds. A background about Hancock. Hancock had studied the unification of Italy for many years, Risorgimento in Italy, but at this very time that Italy itself was making a transition which at least one member of the audience will disagree with me, a transition towards fascism, at least to Mussoliniism. Hancock seems to have had a very strong attraction to strong leaders. He was very interested in strong leaders bringing about the unification of Italy, leaders who prefigured Mussolini, and he was very aware of what was happening in Germany at the time. So Hancock wrote at a time when Hancock, had some sense of a possibility of democracy in a crisis. In that writing, his goal was to capture the essential characteristics of Australian society as he saw it, the essential characteristics of Australian democracy. And his key word for understanding that is fairness. In contrast, Tocqueville saw the essence of American democracy was the notion of equality. In Tocqueville's discussion, he would take some tendency and then take it to the extreme. Think about what the extreme outcomes of that tendency might be. And as though there were no limits to the operation of that tendency. Hancock, fairness as the fundamental or generative principle of Australian democracy, also, one could say in his book, he sees no limits to its working through the society. But he was, like Tocqueville, ultimately pessimistic in that he thought that it would eventually manifest itself in potentially ruinous policies. Paradoxically, however, Hancock seems to end up optimistically, but if you read the book, you can't understand why. At least I can't. The strength of Hancock's Australia is he did grasp something essential about the nation, at least at the time he wrote, and maybe still, in view of William's discussion of the explanations of Australian way. The weakness was he was no social scientist. The weakness was he had no mechanisms which went from individual motivations and behaviour to the social outcomes. He would tell you about things without giving you a possible explanation. The ultimate failure of democracy in Australia that you can read in Hancock's Australia seems to be an unwillingness to sacrifice to the common good. Hard to reconcile with collectivism, but not really if you think it through. Collectivism can be a way of achieving individual goals rather than achieving collective or social or non-individual goals. And there's a lot of emphasis in his book on that aspect of individualism, relying on collective means to help the individual rather than individuals relying on collective means to help the collective. He wrote in 1930, it's very hard to accept that the Australia that he saw and lived through was unwilling to make sacrifice for the common good. After all, he lived through First World War, in which Australians made tremendous sacrifices. We can hardly imagine that they were all motivated by using some collective means for their individual good, namely getting killed in the war. Hancock was writing just as Australia was trying to manage the Great Depression of the 1930s. The mechanism used in Australia, the Great Depression, relied on the Premier's plan, an agreement amongst the Premiers of what to do, and the emphasis in that was equality of sacrifice. That is, individual sacrifice for the collective good. Let's come out of this better than we otherwise would have. And he wrote just before John Lang's huge defeat in New South Wales, because Lang had had radical proposals of dealing with the Depression. How long do I have?
Well, you have plenty of time.
Oh, okay.
I've been speaking for about 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm halfway through. That seems about right?
Yeah.
Okay. William mentioned the view of Australian history, particularly political history, of the Labor Party is Australian history and all the rest is just reaction to the Labor Party. It's so-called Alan Martin's Whig view of Australian history. Hancock takes that view, that policy was always and everywhere driven by the Labor Party or the forces of the Labor Party, and non-Labor was purely reactive. This makes him incapable of making sense of a whole series of events in Australian history, as I've just indicated. For Hancock, the three stools of the Australian way, the three-legged stool I should say, were protectionism, which Williams mentioned, white Australia, and arbitration. And the truth of the matter is, as William mentioned with the name Alfred Deakin, all of those had significant input from non-Labor and was taken into the extremes by non-Labor governments in the 1950s. During the 1950s, take an example, Australia resisted the American international economic push towards free trade and investment flows and insisted that it was a developing country, had to have a special privileges to put on tariffs so that it could develop. Hancock grasped the generative factor in Australia. The underlying factor was a view of fairness, but he failed convincingly to explain it. William's given you a series of possible explanations for the Australian way, and if fairness is the basis of it, you can start applying those to explaining why fairness might be a dominant principle. He failed to explain it because he left out a whole lot of things that were important about Australia. One thing he left out almost completely was religion. In Tocqueville's Democracy in America, considerable discussion of religion. In Hancock, there's virtually nothing at all. Quite puzzling. His father was a vicar. Hancock himself had seriously considered becoming a clergyman. While he was writing the book, he was in reasonably steady communication with his father about the contents of the book. When he was in Adelaide, he was recorded as calling some of his students papists, which I don't think was a term of endearment. So why wasn't the struggle, religious and otherwise struggle, during the First World War over conscription, why doesn't it appear in the book? Why isn't religion appeared in the book? Why doesn't I, speaking as Jonathan Pincus, went to my copy of Australia and looked up the index under conscription. And what I found was an entry for compulsory military training. And the entry said, see defence. So I looked up the entry under defence. There is none. Hancock's trying to explain fairness, but Catholic social doctrines have presumably something to do with the notion of fairness in Australia, since it's my passing understanding of Catholic social doctrines would lead me to think so, but it doesn't appear at all. Now, Tocqueville got American religion wrong. He gave it a great emphasis, but he seems to have got it wrong. He didn't understand the importance of the Great Awakening. And anybody who asks me what that is, I'll say, see Henry's paper. I've got vague idea, but it's something I personally haven't read about. The triumph of Catholicism within the United States in terms of building an American Catholic Church and shift to pantheism. Tocqueville didn't understand evangelicalism, which was certainly evident in the United States at the time he visited. But at least he thought religion was important in determining the United States as a country. In contrast, in Australia, Hancock, religion played no role whatsoever. So he didn't comment on how the temperance movement, which was multi-religious, and certainly had a strong Catholic component, was able to blend in with non-Labour, whereas the Catholics generally supported Labour. When I grew up in Queensland, Jonathan Pincus speaking, the Labour Party was the Catholic Party. That was all about it. There hardly any non-Catholics in it at all. And the Catholics supported Labour until, as you know, it split over communism and anti-communism subsequently. I mentioned earlier that Hancock was very interested in striking individuals, but especially powerful leaders. But his work lacked any analysis. It lacked any of the sorts of explanations that William was asking you to think about. Hancock spent 15 years of his life writing biography of Smuts in South Africa, and nobody would ever read the book on Smuts if they wanted to know about South Africa. They'd only read it if they wanted to know about Smuts. Incidentally, they might learn something about South Africa, but you wouldn't go to it to read about South Africa. You'd read about Smuts. When he returned to Australia, his major project was a magnificent thing called the Australian Dictionary of Biography. He did some other stuff, but that's the major thing he did, which focused entirely on individuals. It's a fantastic resource. I hope you all use it. It's all available free on the internet. Skillfully, and one of the people in the room, where's John Nethercote? How many entries have you written, John?
Me. 4.
4, okay. They're all excellent. So his interest in individuals is individuals, but he wasn't able to give a good explanation of the society which was based on fairness because he had no social mechanisms in his mind. In Tocqueville, there are individuals and there is society, and the individuals create the society and created by the society. In Hancock, there's just an outcome. There are individuals and there's social outcome, but there's no connection between the two. In contrast, as I mentioned earlier, in Tocqueville, there are often mechanisms in which motivations and actions designed to bring about some outcome bring about a completely different outcome. And the French Revolution of 1848 was a prime example of that. An effort to get rid of autocracy ended up recreating an autocracy led by a buffoon. Another minor example in democracy in America, Tocqueville talks about how serving on juries, America has a system, as you know, of juries which are kind of investigatory arrangements as well as decision-making bodies in some other instances. Serving on juries, paradoxically, led to a reduction in engagement of Americans in local political life rather than stimulate it. You may believe it or not believe it. That's the kind of thing that he was trying to talk through. You don't get any of that in Hancock's Australia. Turning more directly to some of the issues William raised, if we are to think of the Australian way, we must think of it in some sense of shared non-conflict, without tremendous amount of conflicts within Australia. If it's the Australian way, then somehow or other conflicts must have been dealt with. In Tocqueville's America, in democracy in America, conflict or factionalism, he thought, was managed or contained by dispersion of political power, tremendous emphasis on decentralisation, dispersion of power, and the growth and importance of local organisation and local voluntary associations, local churches, weak central government, strong local governments, including state governments. And in Tocqueville's writing, that's all taken to help forestall forceful conflict. Wrong. Not very long after he wrote, America had one of the bloodiest civil wars ever seen. His effort, Tocqueville's effort, to try to explain why there wasn't so much conflict may have been a worthwhile effort, it just happens to be wrong. Hancock, however, made no such effort. In particular, Hancock seriously underappreciated how institutions can manage conflicts. Some of the institutions that arise from William's little catalogue early were designed, I think, if I take that functionalist view of institutions, one could rationalise them or see they had the effect of managing conflicts. And they were salient features of Australian life. One of the reasons, my belief, that Australians so frequently look to independent expert panels or bureaucrats to do things is a method of resolving conflict. The Tariff Board, established in 1921, was exactly that kind of organisation. It was designed to prevent members of Parliament having to adjudicate between competing interests. Let this independent body make a decision and we'll accept the system. We don't have to deal with the conflict. The arbitration system was also, can be looked at as a method of resolving and deflecting conflict, although one could argue that sometimes it actually exacerbates it. And a number of other institutions, public works committees, commissions of various kinds. An important element in society, especially British society, but also in other places, that Hancock didn't pick up, which I think influences the way in which you look at the notion of fairness as an explanatory factor in Australia, was what's usually called new liberalism, the emphasis on expertise, on solving problems by using specialists who know about them, planning, eugenics, all of those things, making society scientifically better. That was all going on, had been going on for some decades, very influential, doesn't appear in Hancock whatsoever. He doesn't seem to understand that if you focus this on fairness, then giving over to expert bodies the decisions to make, you have to assume in some fashion that they will succeed in bringing about the fairness that is the motivating factor.
Can you wind up?
Yes, I can, very quickly. Both Hancock and Tocqueville believed in the notion of exceptionalism. For Tocqueville, America was a huge experiment without this restraining weight of the past, but America foreshadows what Tocqueville thinks is going to happen in the rest of the world. The fate of the rest of the world is foreshadowed by the United States. For Hancock, Australia was democracy without the leaven of members of the College of All Souls and without the leaven of the aristocracy. Hancock was very perceptive in understanding that a way of looking at Australia was that it was one vast public utility. That was a very sharp thing to grasp, but unfortunately, the only explanation he really offers to you of that is the incurable romanticism of Australians. There's a quote from him. If you read that little section provided to you by Greg on F.W. Eggleston, who was Minister for Railways in Victoria, if you read his book, he's got much better explanations than that. I'll stand here.
Yeah, please do. Thanks so much.
And I'll pretend that I'm Henry.
It's not an easy thing to do, to present
An unwritten paper by somebody else.
Right, so questions or comments, please? Yes, Greg.
I think...
Greg, could you stand up and project your voice, please?
And say who you are, Greg.
Pretty good. If you take the Tocqueville Hancock comparison, I think there's a further comparison. Tocqueville is basically interested in not just democracy but also aristocracy. His father survived the terror that really came out white hair. So he came from an aristocratic background. In the case of Hancock, he perhaps was taken into the English aristocratic classes. And part of their analysis in both cases, I think, is about democracy, but the thing that's really there is aristocracy. How do you have a democratic society in which there is no aristocracy? In Country and Calling, Hancock makes this curious statement about how there are things he discusses with his privileged classes back in England, but he can't talk about them in Australia because Australia is not capable of being sensible. They look at him fundamentally, something like that. So, but it's not just if you leave out the aristocracy, I think, which is sort of in the background, if you put it back in, I think it makes more sense in both cases.
Yeah, no, I agree. I tried to finish up by saying that for Hancock, democracy was Australia's democracy out the leaven of the All Souls and without the aristocracy. I should have said more about it. I agree with you.
If I could just add something there. It seems that they have very different attitudes to democracy. Hancock believes aristocracy. Hancock believes in the uses of an aristocracy. Yes. Surely you don't really get that much in Tocqueville? At least very delicate, very gently.
Well, I mean, this work on France perhaps is more about... the reason why he would obviously identify democracy with centralisation is because he identifies democracy with Japanese. But it isn't the only... the Girondists, who were federalists, could have taken, under the correct circumstances, could have taken France down a different road during the Revolution if there hadn't been war and stuff.
Right. Other questions and comments? Yes, Rob.
Who are you?
I'm Rob Clark from UWA. I'm not a historian, I'm not a reader of these volumes, but I just have two questions to ask. I'd like opinion on them. The first was one reason for a more collective approach, both in Australia and elsewhere, it seems to me, is often that related to the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, right? This sense that none of us can see our future or the future of our children, and that therefore there's always a finite probability that one of them is going to be in the gutter at some point, and therefore what we need is a collective social insurance. We're likely to buy into that much more readily as a consequence of that. I'd be interested in a comment on that, and its relative application in Australia. The other question concerns immigration. There's been some mention of immigration thus far. It seems to me that's extremely important for the settler economies in general, but also for Australia. When I'm asked by visitors who come and they say, well, can we go and eat some typically Australian cooking, or can we do something that's typically Australian? And I'm a member of a family, I'm married to an immigrant and so forth, and I don't really know what the answer to that question is. And I bear in mind that in Australia almost 1/3 of our citizens are foreign born, and that we are a complex mix of different cultures. I'm seeking a comment on this because it seems to me that perhaps the rate at which the proportion of foreign-born has been rising has accelerated recently, but it would always have been comparatively high. And yet, we maintain this Australian way that William discusses, that seems to have survived this massive influx of foreign culture into Australia, which has been continuous over 200 years.
Well, can I go at those in the order? On the first, namely that we all should take out an insurance policy against bad outcomes for people that we care for, including ourselves. That's true everywhere. We've got to make it especially pertinent for Australia to explain some difference between Australia and other places. And when you think of Australia as being for such a long time an urbanised society, highly urbanised, and a very wealthy society from once the development of Australia began for whatever reasons, then you'd have to build an argument which says that a rich urbanised society is more likely to be that look for collectivised risk insurance rather than individualised risk insurance. You can make those arguments, but they're not that easy. On the immigration, the late 19th century did see a change in the ratio of immigrants to native-born, and some people, I think, for example, Hugh Stretton, in a famous essay he did many, many years ago on a symposium on Australia in Daedalus, American scientific magazine, he argues that you had the gold rushes with all of these enthusiastic, individualistic sort of people, and then they had children who were all rich and boring and looked to consolidate what they had rather than create a new thing, and became extremely conservative and looked for protection against the vagaries of the world. So immigration has been used as a part of an explanation of, especially the Australian settlement of Deaconite settlement of protectionism and white Australian arbitration and a couple of other things. I think the slightly different way of putting your question is, will some unique or at least...
influenced by a resident of Perth, wasn't he?
I think you should tell them. No, please.
Greg Moore knows a lot about it.
Greg Moore. Let's have somebody who really knows about it.
Shan was the very first professor of economics at UWA, and he founded effectively economics in Western Australia back in the 1930s through to the 1930s. And his very first hiring was in fact Hancock.
Mm-hmm.
And Hancock was very much influenced by Shan in all his writings. And Shan became increasingly libertarian in orientation, pro-market in orientation, and leery about collective activism. So you can see Hancock as being a shadow of Shan,
Sure.
and therefore indirectly a Western Australian product, but that's another statement.
And underline that a little bit. Shan wrote this fabulous book called An Economic History of Australia, which his message simply is that Australia was built by the tall poppies of the country. Okay? But the trouble was, the tall poppies were always being cut down by the small poppies. So there's a very definite parallel between that emphasis on the great individual of Shan and this admiration for the great natural aristocrat.
That's true. And Nick Cater will bring it up again. Yeah.
Rightio, let's leave it there. Thank you very much.